So I will start by giving you kind of the overview of the framework of the workshop and the goal of the workshop. So the goal is we want to give you a understanding of graph neural networks on a quite detailed level. We want to show how they work, and we want to show you how transformer neural networks are very similar things. So we will actually explain transformers through the lens of graph neural networks. And the main reason for doing this is because we believe that by knowing this, you can develop models which are well tailored to your problem. So a couple more words on this. In difference, I think, from if we think about computer vision networks, where the problem domain was kind of fixed and how you model the problem was kind of fixed. You had a couple of different perhaps ways of trying to do computer vision, like semantic segmentation or image classification and so on. For graph neural networks, we often have a very more specialized problem. So we have some kind of domain which we might want to model as graphs. But in this problem, we often need to introduce our own knowledge about the problem, which we encode in the graph. And to make good models for these problems, it often helps to actually go in and change the neural network's inner workings. We'll talk more about that during the latter parts of this workshop. So to give you kind of a picture of what we will do, so we will look at these graph neural networks, which kind of they are neural networks which structure their computation based on a graph, and we'll then show how these are well suited to be expanded to essentially induce structure from arbitrary sets. And when I say set in this case, think of a finite set of nodes, for example, the nodes of a graph. So a couple of words about what this workshop perhaps isn't. So first of all, what is this workshop? So we want to give a detailed dive into graph neural networks. We will spend a lot of time on actual practical programming. And the programming you will see is quite opinionated. So it does things in certain ways which might not be generalizable. But this is not a workshop for general modeling of graph problems. That's I would say, a different topic, a very important topic, but then we couldn't talk that much about the nitty-gritty programming details. So we'll not cover graph theory or network analysis and these kind of classical graph algorithms. That's also for another, that would be another course or workshop. And also don't see this as best practice necessarily. We do this we program these notebooks in a way for a reason, but not necessarily for the highest efficiency. And then in practice, when you use a graph neural network, you might actually want to use a more high-level framework like PyTorch Geometric, which has become the de facto framework for doing graph neural networks in PyTorch, at least. So the structure of this workshop is based on these Jupyter notebooks, which I hope everyone has gotten a link to. Otherwise I'll send the links to the chat here to all of the materials we need. You will be working in small groups on these notebooks and try to work through them together and understand the content together. The primary method of asking questions and getting answers will be through this HackMD. So this is a collaborative document, a markdown document, so the same we use to write readmes on GitHub, or indeed the text sections of the notebooks. So if you haven't registered your account there, please do so that you will be able to actually edit the document and write your questions. For each of the different sessions, there is a separate question box, and write your questions there. You will see that perhaps I should actually bring this up. That there is a more detailed view. So this is the document. I hope you can all see it. And you can see at the end here, there are these sections. So write your question here. And then me or one of the other tutors will then write an answer. Right. So it has full Markdown support. So if you like to, you can write LaTeX formulas. You can make lists or link images. We will be using Google Colab to work with the notebooks because it's a very convenient way of sharing and working with notebooks. So one point here is that before you start working on the notebook, you need to make a local copy. Otherwise, the changes you make to the notebook will not be saved. We are relying on a third-party package manager called Anaconda to install complex dependencies. So, and the downside to this is that this will need to be installed each time you restart your notebook runtime. And this can take up towards 10 minutes to install all the packages. So it's nice to not shut down your runtime too often. One thing is that a lot of these notebooks are quite large, so making use of this table of contents on the left-hand side is a good idea, where you can swiftly navigate through the different sections of the notebook. There's also this, I mentioned this, Anaconda. So most notebooks which have complex dependencies, so that's most notebooks except the two first ones, have these preambles, which you should execute first. Start with this cell, which will download this Anaconda Python distribution and install it. That will then restart the kernel. So don't run any other cells before this has started and says restarting kernel. And then run this second cell just to make sure that everything is okay. And you should get the output, everything is okay. Right, so now to the more giving the context to what we will be doing here. So the first question, what a graph is. So these examples from Stanford's very excellent course on graph neural networks shows us some of the examples. What kind of things, what kind of phenomena do we want to encode with graphs? So you can see example here as knowledge graphs, where there might be concepts and we have an understanding of relationship between these concepts. Or one of the most common examples, a social network. We have people and we have some kind of links between peoples, like friend relationships on social networks or social media platforms. Citation networks, how do different scientific publications cite each other, or complex systems. We have modeled a system with complex interactions, relationships between entities in the system. Programs are often analyzed in terms of trees or graphs. So a tree, in this case, is a certain kind of graph. 3D meshes, for example, we can think of graphs embedded in 3 dimensions. So each node in the graph or each entity in the graph is actually a point in space with 3 coordinates, and the relationship between nodes are these edges which build up the meshes. The faces of the mesh. Or computer networks, where we have these different computational devices which communicate with each other over a network. Or language, and I'm putting question mark on language there because that's an interesting question we'll get back to later when we start to talk about transformers. So in all, we can pretty much encode any kind of pairwise relationship between some kind of entities using graphs, which is a very, very powerful modeling tool, which is also the reason for why I think graph neural networks are one of the most interesting developments in deep learning for a very long time. I think this will open up the kind of things we can do with machine learning quite a lot. So in this workshop, we'll use one practical example, and we will use the example of molecules and doing predictions on molecules. So there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that a lot of people are familiar with kind of what a molecule is. And it's a nice mapping from a molecule to a graph representation. So that also helps the kind of giving us an intuition of what's going on. But also because I'm familiar with these problems. And lastly, because I want to have a practical data set we can work with. And there are plenty of open, interesting data sets in this domain. So a question about these slides, they will definitely be available. I will link them from the HackMD. They will also be available from we'll see with the train resources on the NCS, we typically link to the material. I can send you directly through mail the links to these slides. So a couple of examples of applications of graph neural network. So this example shows us a complex interaction network, so trying to predict side effects from different drugs, and especially in combination, so taking multiple different drugs in combination, can we predict side effects? Another example which I find very interesting is this idea of trying to going from very principled methods of doing, for example, force field calculations. Right, so can you get the slides now? Yes, you can. So we'll take a short break and I'll just send you the link to these first slides. I will send you a link on Google Drive. You can download a PDF from there. Let's see here. So the link to the presentation is there. So if you would like to follow along during the presentation and take annotations, for example, do so there. So back to this example, I sent a link in the chat to be clear. So in this, in the field of trying to understand molecules, there are these methods where we can try to, for example, we would like to know about the forces acting upon atoms in the molecules using what we know about, for example, quantum mechanics. There are methods for computing these, which are typically quite slow. But what we've seen recently is we can use neural networks to essentially use the slow methods to generate data, which we can then train our neural networks to try to make faster predictions from. So these kind of often called neural network force fields or neural potentials and so on is a very exciting branch of this understanding molecules at a very low level, which I believe will greatly help us build even better models in the future. And here we've seen that we can do this for small molecules or even larger systems. Another similar example is using these kind of methods to create simulations or approximate dynamics simulations, essentially. So we have some kind of simulation. In this case, it's kind of a physics simulator trying to understand, if a ball hits this cloth, how will the cloth deform? This is the same idea here has been used to accelerate, for example, computational fluid dynamics simulations and these kind of ideas. These are also using graph neural networks. Another interesting topic is that of approximating solutions to really hard problems. So this is yet to be published work by some of my colleagues. Daniel and Carlos will be helping us today as well. So when it comes to graphs and modeling with graphs, you quickly encounter hard problems. The kind of problems we computer scientists called NP hard problems. Those are problems where we don't know of any efficient algorithm for producing optimal results. So there are methods of trying to solve these problems anyway. So one of the most common is to use smart search algorithms coupled with what's called constraint programming to be able to still search this space of possible solutions and actually find a very good one. So you can actually use that to create solutions to these problems, but it's still very hard. So what you can do instead is that you use a graph neural network to try to predict a solution to these problems. So think of this as a learned heuristic algorithm. In this case, my colleagues, they are trying to actually produce a schedule for this is a network of small devices which communicate over radio. These small devices have this kind of tags which we would like to read. But we want to do this, we essentially operate in a very, very low powered environment. So the question is how to schedule reading of these tags so that we don't also have issues with interference and so on. So what they've seen here is that they can actually train a graph neural network to produce this schedule. And then what they also see is that the graph neural network is able to actually generalize outside of the training domain, the sizes of the networks it was trained on. And I think this kind of this kind of approaches of getting pretty good approximations of really hard problems is super interesting applications of these kind of methods. So another really interesting application. So just to take a rather hyped paper. So this was a preprint article published by DeepMind very recently, where they show that they can actually train agents to generalize to kind of completely new tasks. That's the main takeaway from this. But an interesting thing is that they define this task using logical propositions, and they can then generate new logical propositions to essentially generate new tasks. But interestingly, in this domain, they actually use a kind of graph neural network to embed these logical propositions, to actually learn what these propositions mean. And I think this is also a very interesting application of graph neural network. You might not think of this proposition as being a graph, but the same fundamental ideas as we use in graph neural networks can also be used here. And then we'll take a look at transformers. So these two different architectures are often viewed as very different things. So graph neural networks are kind of defined in terms of the graphs typically, while transformers have been seen as these kind of sequence models used for text or text-like problems, where we essentially only work with sequences. So the aim of this workshop, one of them, is that you will see that the transformer is not actually a sequence model. The transformer is a model which works on sets. But to give you kind of an overview of things which have been done with the transformer. So it's mostly been in the field of natural language processing. So this is an example which got a lot of attention. So was this, well, last summer essentially, where OpenAI had built this very, very large language model, and they could actually start generating language which was surprisingly good. Now they could also see that these kind of models could actually be used as kind of an open question answering system. So you could phrase questions to the system and could actually give you answers which at times were good or correct without any context other than that this network has been trained on huge amounts of data collected from the internet. So this is a really cool example where this model just generates a text based on a simple prompt. So the prompt, the importance of being on Twitter by Jerome K. Jerome, London summer 1897. That's what the model starts using, and then it just continues predicting things based on this. Another example of where this idea has been used is also in the context of molecules, but instead of seeing the molecule as a graph, we can take the graph and linearize it into a sequence of, or a sequence-based format or a string-based format, which still contains the information of the graph, but more like, imagine if you know about, well, any program essentially, any computer program, you can actually see it's a sequence of characters, but it actually encodes a kind of graph. And this is kind of a similar idea, this representation of molecules called smiles. And here they show that a transformer can be used in this context to, in this case, predict reactions. Rather well, surprisingly well, perhaps, in the context of what we have done here. And another really interesting application of transformers. So an interesting problem is that of trying to predict a protein's like geometric structure only from the sequence of amino acids in it. This is there is this I think it's bi-yearly competition on trying to actually produce or predict these kind of these structures or protein foldings. So we've seen some progress here with DeepMind, so the advanced research company owned by Alphabet, Google's mother company. They have produced a couple of interesting works here. So they started doing one called AlphaFold, which essentially used graph neural networks. But the last competition, they actually went to using transformers instead. So instead of just looking at graphs, they actually look at any pairwise interactions in this sequence of amino acids, We'll talk more about these kind of problems in the fourth session of this workshop. And then another in a similar domain. So a curious result where a group from primarily Salesforce, a company doing a lot of AI research because their main product is based a lot on actually understanding language or natural language processing. They try to apply these very simple models which are used for text, or simple I should say, sorry. These models which have been used a lot for text. So the known models, to just apply them on the sequence of the amino acid sequence of the protein, so the primary structure. And what they see is that they actually can, by looking at this transformer and how it activates, they can identify some really interesting properties. So for example, the parts of the sequence which will end up close together in 3D space, but which are far apart in the 1D space, so to say, they can actually see that the network learns to recognize them somehow. This is still, I would say, curious, and we'll see where this goes, whether there are a lot of substance to this. And then we've started seeing transformers being kind of extended to other domains, and one of the most perhaps publicly acknowledged domains is that of computer vision. So instead of using the traditional convolutional neural networks, where we induce a very, very strict structure on the neural network, we instead use transformers, which do not assume the same structures. There are some issues here, but what they show is that they can essentially get the same or even better performance than from traditional convolutional neural networks. And in particular, when coupling this with what's called self-supervised learning, we have seen really interesting progress the last couple of years in the computer vision domain, where we no longer rely on or models trained using, for example, the ImageNet dataset. So no longer pre-trained on the classification task, but instead trained on these more, we shouldn't say unsupervised tasks, but more towards that way of solving them. Right, so that was a couple of examples of applications of both graph neural networks and transformers. So now we'll go more to what we're going to talk about in today's session. So we will, the first session will cover graph basics, essentially. It will prepare us for what we need to be able to take a graph representing some kind of problem we're interested in and feeding that graph into a graph neural network. It will be a lot about these kind of data mangling things we often need to do within a new machine learning project, especially for neural networks. But before that, we'll talk a bit about the graphs. So we've already kind of talked about that. Well, a graph is kind of a couple of entities and the relationship between them, the pairwise relationship between them. We typically define a graph like this. So we have this V and E. So these V and E are sets. V is the set of all nodes. So we think of all of our rings here. That's our node set. And then E, that's the pairs of nodes which denote these edges or relationship between nodes. This is something which we will work a lot with. We'll also talk a lot about neighborhoods when we come later, when start talking about the graph neural networks and how they work. But essentially, neighborhood is the nodes which have edges to a single node. So a neighborhood is centered on some node, in this case, this green node. Then its neighborhood is all of the adjacent nodes. So adjacency here is the connected by edges. And then we typically need to somehow refer to the nodes. We'll give them some kind of ID. So an important point to point out here is that the ID is typically not meaningful. The ID is not some attribute we want to learn from. Instead, the ID is just a way of differentiating nodes. So for example, for me to be able to say that there is an edge between two nodes, I need to somehow be able to refer to them. We typically do this using integer indices in this case. In this case, numbered from 1, but we will use 0 as starting index typically. Then labels or attributes, those are things we know about the nodes. These are typically not unique to nodes. If they are, they aren't that interesting in this context typically. But these could be, for example, age of a person in a social network. It could be the type of atom in a molecule, or kind of any property we're interested in. We also have, we can have labels on the edges as well. So each edge might have an attribute, like let's say the distance between nodes in some kind of, if it's a map, or it could be the capacity of the node. If it's a road network, it could be the type of bond in a molecule. And for these attributes, we'll typically describe them as having different types. In this notebook, we'll mainly focus on two different types of variables because we need to treat them differently in the neural network. So the first one, the discrete type, those are the values of these variables. So let's say it's a bond type in a molecule. We typically consider that being a discrete type. So it can take one of a finite and often predefined number of values. Another example is the result on a dice. That is also a discrete number of values. So we will mainly use this for these variables. We'll treat them as categorical. That means that we do not assume that there is some kind of ordinal relationship between the values of these this variable. So, for example, in a dice, there is we can order the values of the dice according to their numerical magnitude, so to say. But for example, in this case with an urn and the colored balls, we do not assume that there is an ordered relationship between the colors. This is typically the view we will have in this workshop, that we don't consider such ordinal relationships, even though they might be such. And then there's the other kind of variables. We call them continuous here. So these are variables which take a value from typically interval, but you can think of it as an infinite set. So for example, temperature or a coordinate or pair of coordinates. And what we will spend a lot of time doing these first two notebooks is actually going from having these attributes on nodes and edges to representing them with feature vectors. So each node will be represented by a single dense vector. So what I mean with dense is that most values in this vector will be non-zero. We'll do the same for edges as well. We'll also talk a lot about this more later when we start to talk about the graph neural network, but we'll cover it some in the second session, where we'll talk about this encoding the structure of the graph. And one of the important ways to do that is using this adjacency matrix. So the adjacency matrix, think of each row here as corresponding to one of the nodes, the same with each column. So the first row here corresponds to the first node here, the second row to the second node. And then we encode all the pairwise relationship between these nodes in this matrix. And in this case, the relationship we want to encode is whether there is an edge between these two nodes or not. So we see that from node 0, it has only one edge. So it's only a single indicator variable for that. It's a 1 which indicates there is an edge between node 1 and 2. And in this case, this relationship is symmetric. So you see that there is also from node 2 to node 1 we also have an edge. And then we can encode all of the structure of the graph using this adjacency matrix. There are other ways of doing this. So for example, we can instead have a list of these coordinates of the adjacency matrix. So we go back one step, you can see, well, we have coordinate 1, 2. So row 1, column 2. That would then be 1, 2 in this case. And depending on what we can try to encode whether these are symmetrical relationship or not. In this workshop, we'll mostly work with graphs which are undirected. So we'll not really go deep into the difference between them and how to work with it. The kind of representations we have chosen is agnostic to whether they are undirected or directed graphs. We can also have another representation of the same thing, which is that think of this as kind of a 2-level map. So at the first level, we have keys being node indices, and the values is the list of other node indices this node has an edge to. So you can see here, node 1 has an edge to node 2, node 2 has an edge to 1, 3, and 4, and so on. We typically refer to these representations. These three all capture the exact same thing. But we refer to this as a dense representation, meaning that we represent every possible pair, which can be for graphs which are very large but have relatively few edges. This will be a very inefficient representation. While this list of edges and this adjacency list are sparse representation. We only encode the values which have non-zeros in them in the adjacency matrix, essentially. And then finally, we'll talk a bit about the different levels of representation for graphs. So there might, depending on the task you have, there might be multiple different ways you would like to think of the graph or things you would like to predict on the graph. So on the node level, you might want to predict something on each node. So if this was a social network, perhaps you want to predict some kind of property for each person in that social network, whether they're a troll or not, for example. On the edge level, we might want to predict some kind of pairwise relationship between nodes in the graph, or whether there should be a relationship. So for example, in a recommendation system, or once again, in a social network, let's say one of these social media platforms, they want to suggest a friend to you. Then what they want to do is they want to predict whether there should be an edge between you and that other person. And then graph level representation. Here we want to predict things about whole graphs. This is primarily the examples we will use in this workshop to have a graph and predict something about it. In this case, we'll predict properties of this graph, of molecular graphs. There are two different kinds of graph learning we often think about. One is called transactive, one is called inductive. So the idea with transactive learning is essentially you have a single graph you're interested in. So let's say you are one of these social media tech giants. You have a single social network and you like to understand things about your social network. So you have the same nodes essentially, but you want to understand things about them. So here we typically see methods like clustering nodes, for example, or trying to understand properties of neighborhoods in this graph and so on. So here one might use a lot of traditional graph algorithms and network analysis. The other focus of learning graph is inductive learning. So here you actually want to generalize from one graph or from a set of graphs, different graphs, to a new set of graphs. And this is the primary view we will have on graph learning today. So imagine you have graphs. These could be, let's say, they could be road networks, they could be molecules, they could be systems of things, systems of, let's say, different species which interact in a complex dynamic system, and you would like to be able to generalize to other such systems, not only analyzing the same system you have. The way we'll do this is by using these graph neural networks. And an important point to make clear is kind of how they work. So they are a kind of neural network which takes as input a number of vectors, these feature vectors. The neat thing about them is to take an arbitrary number of these inputs. So they can take 4, they can take 5, or they can take 20, the same network. So they actually are invariant to the input size. At least they are computationally, then what they actually learn might be very dependent on the kind of sizes of networks they have seen. But then for each input vector into this model, they will output one vector. This network will kind of contain complex aggregate information of all of these inputs with nonlinear transformation. So saying that each of these nodes correspond to, or each of these vectors correspond to the nodes in the graph, that is no longer true. These correspond to high-level complex interactions between potentially all of the nodes of the graph. And then, so we get an arbitrary set of outputs for an arbitrary set of inputs. So depending on what we want to do, if we want to do node, edge, or graph level prediction, we need to take these output vectors and do something with it. And this is where we apply something we call a prediction head. So depending on the context we're working on, we'll still be using the same node outputs from the GNN, but then combining them in different ways. If we want to predict something for each node, then we apply a prediction head to each vector output from this neural network. If we want to do it on the pair or edge level, we take pairs of these nodes, which then correspond to the same pairs in the input network, in the input. Or if we want to make a graph prediction, we take all of these vectors and somehow aggregate them. We'll talk more about this in session 3 when we talk more about graph neural networks or the workings of them. So session 1 then, this will be about going from a graph which might have this representation. So we have things, these in this case small towns. We might have a relationship between them, which might be symbolized by road connections. We want to take this and want to massage it into a format which is suitable to input to our graph neural network. So first we need to, for each node here, for example, and each edge, we need to create these vectors, these feature vectors. And the challenge here is if you, for example, have a, in this case, the label here, think of that as just being an identity. That's not actually a attribute we want to encode, but we have these two numerical values. So the question is, how do we go from these numerical values to this vector? Or if we have a combination of these kind of categorical variables and these continuous variables, how do we combine them into a single feature vector? So that's the question for session 1. What we'll eventually will have is this kind of feature matrix for the nodes. And the pipeline for doing this, which we'll practically work with, looks something like this. So we have our data where we might have these C or 6R. These are, think of them as categorical variables. We need to do something different with them than with our numerical variables. And this pipeline here, which you see here, is about how we do that with neural networks. And importantly, we will look at what's called an embedding layer. So I'll just mention this here. We're not going to dive into it in the workshop, but it has been customary to use what's called one-hot encodings or one-hot vectors. For other machine learning methods, that makes sense, but for neural networks, you should avoid that at all costs, at least if you use modern frameworks. So instead, you should use what's called an embedding layer, and each categorical value should instead be represented by an integer. You'll see how to do this in the notebook. And then if we have multiple variables, we need to somehow combine them, and we'll talk a bit. You'll see a bit of different ways of doing that in this workshop. And finally, get this. The output here is this feature vector we want in the end. So that's my introductory presentation. So welcome back to the second session of the Graph Neural Networks and Transformers workshop. So in the first session, we focused a lot on representing like the inputs to our networks. So we looked a bit at these categorical variables, or we looked a lot at them, because typically they are the more challenging one to actually handle. Since the continuous ones, we could just send them right into the network as is a vector of them. But the categorical ones, we have to first embed, creating these embeddings. So first, the graphs to tensors, we kind of started with some graph and we wanted to create these vectors from them. And the way we did that was essentially using this kind of pipeline. So we start out with, and think of these things that we have here are the variables for a single node in the graph. It might have different attributes. So for example, this C belongs to one of its categorical variables, could be atom type, while 6R, I'm not exactly sure what this is here. That's a different categorical variable. Then we need to embed those, and to keep track of the embedding, we have to first we have to map them to an integer, because that's what the embedding layer needs as an input. So each symbol is mapped to a distinct integer, is indexed from 0. So we need to keep track of this mapping. That's one thing to have in mind. And then in the model, you'll see a bit of it here. We do this embedding. So essentially the data input, that's these symbols, but the embeddings are part of the model. And then in the end, we combine them somehow, whether we want to use concatenation or summation. We talked in depth. I added a bit in the HackMD about when you would like to use concatenation, because there are times that's exactly what you want. Now in the session 2, we will now take these features we have looked at and try to create a data set of them. So this will be a lot of like manipulating these arrays and trying to make them into things which our PyTorch framework can handle. So essentially we need to create these dense multi-dimensional arrays, or tensors as PyTorch like to call them. And what this will essentially be about is first packing the node features into a matrix, but then also looking at the edge features and how we can represent them, where the edge features can be a bit more challenging. And especially there's a lot of more different ways we could think about representing them. But here we can think of each edge feature as being a feature of the relationship between two nodes. So we then want to, in this case, have that kind of a matrix of the relationships, just like the adjacency matrix, but instead of just having a single scalar in each of these, so the slides. They are linked from the HackMD, but I'll send a link here as well. So good for reminding. Thank you for reminding me. So I'll send it in the chat here. That's the right one. Yes. There you go. So there you have the slides. So these slides aren't as many as the last slide deck. So we'll go through this quite fast, I think. So this is kind of the main topic of session 2. So going from these, we now have feature vectors for all of our entities in our network. We have them for the nodes and we have them for the edges. Now we should create these tensors which we can feed into our neural network. And one of the challenges with doing this is the batching of graphs. So since the graphs are typically different size, it means that when we create a batch of graphs, we will have different parts of this batch will essentially be invalid. So we'll need to create a regular size tensor. It needs to have as many elements on all axes, so to say. But then for some of these graphs, so to say, if you think of these slices here of the different graphs, there are invalid elements. So this is something we will need to handle in our neural network so that we don't actually use these invalid elements of our tensors to do things. This will then, we will need to create these kind of tensors all the time where we think of some of the values of the tensors are invalid and we'll need to figure out how to work with them. The way we do it, so, okay, I'll back way one step and say that the problem with this is that the neural network parts we will use, we'll talk more about this tomorrow, they essentially think of all of these elements in this 3 tensor as being valid. So they will produce something, a non-zero value or non-pad value in all of the positions. So we'll typically have a process which kind of looks like this, that we feed this tensor through our neural network, and out comes a new tensor with new values, but values in all of the places. So what we need to do then is that we need to kind of recreate this setting where some of the values are actually invalid or padded. And we will use this idea of a mask. So mask here will be, think of it as a binary matrix in this case. So we will look a bit at how to create these masks. It doesn't need to be the same shape as this tensor we want to kind of mask out. It only needs to kind of understand that. So if you see this mask, you can kind of see it. If you see this tensor from the side here, you can see that we, in the padded positions, we have zeros, and in non-padded, we have ones. We can then use this mask to essentially zero out parts of the tensor, which should not be computed on. So by setting the values to 0, our matrix multiplication in the neural network will not use those values. And also the gradient going backwards will be zeroed out at those steps. So we'll have a pipeline which looks something like this. So we have some tensor which have padded values. It goes through our neural network and creates a tensor without padded values. And then we apply our mask and we use an operation called broadcasting to do this, to zero out those values again. This we need to repeat a lot of times in our neural networks. We'll not in this session focus on this, the neural network part. We'll focus more on producing these masks, which we'll need, and producing these batches so that we can pass them through our neural network. So that's kind of the context for this session 2. I will also show you a bit about the notebooks. So there are 2. And can I get them? So let's see here. So we start with one notebook called 2A. The idea of this notebook is to give you an overview of the full training pipeline. So we'll go through everything. So all of the code here, this is from the previous notebook, kind of adjusted a bit to this notebook. We will see the dataset class. This is the main thing of this second session, the dataset class, and what's called a collate class, which is used to create these mini batches for a data loader. Now, what I want you to do in this first notebook is not to go through it in detail, because all of these things are then explained more in depth in the notebook 2B. So the goal of 2A is to get an idea of the overall structure of this training pipeline, so that you can then in 2B go through the code in detail and understand what all of these things do. So I would say you shouldn't spend more than 20 or 30 minutes, let's say, on the 2A notebook. What we will try to challenge you to do in this notebook is to essentially try to make the network make good predictions. So here, instead of just summarizing the performance of our network into a single value, like in this case, the ROC AUC, which is a common metric to evaluate binary classifiers, we also provide these distributions of your predictions. So what you see here is how my network have the logits, so the scores, my network have assigned to each and every example in my training batch. So what I hope to see during training is that these distributions kind of go apart. Then I can also use my validation dataset to see whether they do that in general or just for my training dataset, to kind of get a better idea of how good is my model actually performing without just aggregating everything to a single statistic. And I should say something about the training is that we have this trainer object, which keeps track of your model and how long you have trained it, essentially. It has a train method, which you call with the number of epochs you want to train. So you can continue training by calling this cells multiple times and changing the value. It will not reset the model during that time. So to reset the model, you need to rerun one of the later the cells here. Right, and then the majority of your time you should spend going through this, and in particular trying to figure out what's going on with essentially these steps, the packing of features and so on. There's also at the end in the task, there is an optional task. So in this notebook, the tasks are actually asking questions. The optional task is trying to implement another representation of the edge features. I do not think you should spend time on trying to do this unless you have a lot of time. Right, so that's the setup for the second session. So welcome everyone to the second day of this Graph Neural Network and Transformer workshop. So today we will talk a bit more, we will talk in detail about the Graph Neural Network layer today. So I'm going to go through the important workings of it and also show you how we will actually implement it in code, or give you a hint about that anyway. So this is the schedule for today. we will have this introduction. I think it will be a bit longer than the 30 minutes I had roughly planned before. So we'll see, but hopefully that will be useful for working on the notebooks then. So we'll take the introduction, then work on the notebooks and take a lunch break. I think it's probably a good idea that you take a break on your own, let's say 10:30, something like that, in your groups. So just a recap of yesterday, we talked a bit about graphs and how we can represent them in code. So we looked at taking a graph and then in particular generating these kind of feature vectors for the different parts of the graph. So node feature vectors and edge feature vectors. We looked at this pipeline for doing where categorical variables are first mapped to an integer index and then passed through an embedding layer. And the result is then combined. We talked a lot about how to do that combination, but summing is actually not a very bad idea. And I'll talk a little bit more about that today, about sums of vectors in general. And then we talked a bit about how we can create these kind of PyTorch data sets, which we use to train our neural network models. So a big part of this is creating these kind of matrices for the node vectors and 3 tensors for the edge feature vectors. We also talked a bit about this issue with having different sized things now in our batch. Now we can use these kind of masks to essentially zero out computations. So now we will go into detail of these neural networks that you had some experience with yesterday. And I know some of you looked at the implementation and tried to figure out what was going on there. So hopefully this presentation will give you a bit more context and explain a bit with more intuition about what's going on. So first of all, this is kind of the picture we had yesterday. And the important thing to point out here that this GNN, it is invariant of the input size. So the same GNN can be fed with GNN, that's graph neural networks, can be fed with 4 vectors, as in this case, or it can be fed with 10 vectors. And the exact same neural network will handle this without problem. So in difference from other neural networks, these are not limited to the input size. So kind of like recurrent neural networks, there are some fundamental similarities. I'm not going to go into them here, but essentially they adapt to arbitrary input sizes. That is not to say that they will generalize to arbitrary input sizes. So if I train my neural networks on the graphs up to say, let's say 10 nodes, then expecting to generalize to 100 nodes is probably too much. So one of the common ways of trying to communicate what these things do is what's called a message passing view. So message passing algorithms are quite common. So in for example, inference for graphical models, so that's a way of modeling things in statistical learning, I have an algorithm called message passing for doing inference. But also network analysis algorithms, especially if you want to do large scale network analysis, you might use similar algorithms. They might be called gossip algorithms and so on, because the general idea is that we have this network and the nodes in the network send information along to the neighbors in this network. So if I am a node in the network, let's say node 5 in this case, I get information from my neighbors about what they know about the network. So in a sense, we can think of this as we're kind of gossiping. And we have this local rule, which then decides how this algorithm works. Through this local rule, we can actually learn quite a lot about the larger structure of our network. So by iterating this, so my neighbor's neighbors has sent information one step that will then like spread throughout the network, this gossip of information. And eventually that information will reach me as well. And then I will be able to know something about, well, my neighbors have, in this case, one neighbor in common, for example, and there is another node 2 hops away, or 3 hops away in this case, node 1. So with this simple idea of a very local rule, a rule which we apply everywhere, we can learn more global things about the network or the graph in question. So the idea here is that we have this local rule and we apply it everywhere. We can think of this as these messages we pass around. We send messages to each of our neighbors, or conversely, we receive messages for each of our neighbors. So what you see here is all the different, in a single step of this algorithm, all these aggregations of messages occur. So we have in the first step, node 1 is then the, I call it centered node here. That's not the best name necessarily, but when it acts as center nodes, it aggregates information from node number 2. And when node number 2 is a central node, like in the second case here, it aggregates information from 1, 3, and 4. And then when 3 is the center node, it aggregates information from 2, 4, and 5, and so on. So all of this is kind of done in parallel. And that's the basic idea of this message passing algorithm. So another way to think about what we could do is essentially think of an outbox. So everyone places their outgoing messages in this outbox, so they have a slot dedicated to them. And then each node reads from this aggregated, or from this outbox, from the neighbors which are relevant. So node 1 reads from the second slot here because it's neighbor to the second node. Node 2 reads from the first, third, and fourth slots, and so on. The reason for why I show this picture is because, well, okay, let's first take this step. So essentially this parallel thing, I said all of these things happen at the same time. We can visualize it like this. So node 1 reads from 2, node 2 reads from 1, 3, and 4, and so on. And this is actually very similar to what we looked at in the second session yesterday, where we create this node feature matrix. So think of this as essentially this outbox in our case here, which we'll then use to, So that's this kind of assumes that the messages I send are independent of the receiver. I don't really care about the receiver, so I send a message, and anyone who is interested in my message gets the same message essentially. But we can also think of wanting to actually send personalized messages. So for example, node 2 here, it sends different messages depending on who the receiver is. And to implement this in practice, we can think of this as actually, instead of having a shared outbox, so to say, which everyone reads from, everyone has their own inbox essentially. So in node 2 here would, for example, send this message to node 1's inbox at the place node 2, so that when node 1 then wants to read these messages, it knows that this was from node 2. And just to point out, we would do this for all nodes. I just show one example here because it gets quite messy trying to visualize all of this. And then node 3, for example, it gets the message from node 2, a different message than one node 1 got, to its inbox. And the same for node 4. We would do this for all of the nodes. So for example, node 3 would send a personalized message to node 2's inbox in the third place here, and so on. And this is analogous to this. We talked a bit about this graph, these edge features, and how we think of packing them in a 3 tensor like this. So you could think of this personalized inboxes we have here as kind of the front side here of this edge feature 3 tensor. So the messages I showed you here, this one, it's not the same graph, so don't try to compare them directly, but essentially we see that 2 is still connected to 4 and 3 in this case. So you can see that those would be the message, or 1, 3, 4, and 3. So this kind of row here corresponds to this row here. We'll look a bit more on this in the code. So by reading code, you will hopefully get an idea of how we need to do this. But there is a complication here, and that's of course that when we had independent features like this, we only need to generate a single message. So the computation we need to do to kind of make up these messages is linear in the number of nodes there are. While here, it would need to be quadratic, because we need to make a new message for each of our neighbors, or rather it's proportional to the edges in the network. But in the worst case, it's quadratic because we actually need to write messages to everyone when we want to send anything. With this representation, it will be quadratic in the memory we need. So this representation has huge downsides like we talked about yesterday. So what about what I previously knew? So if this is a kind of gossip protocol where we spread information with messages, it's probably important to keep track of what I knew. So I should probably not forget what I knew. So what we typically do, there are many ways of doing this. The science space here is really large. But in general, you can think of keeping track of let's say a ledger or a notebook internally, that is where we aggregate information. Then when we send messages, we base those on what we know. But we use some kind of function to go from our, let's call it node state, to our messages. So putting all this together would look something like this. So first of all, in the first phase, we decide what messages to send. So we will base that on the current state we have. Then we will kind of send this to the important recipients, or you can think of this as aggregating this node feature matrix, or as it's called in the notebook, the neighbor features. So these are the neighbor features. This transformation we do is typically a multi-layer perceptron. We'll look more in detail on that in the next slide. And then when we do this aggregation, we read our neighbors' messages, but we also add in the things we know. And we might add in this with some transformation on it as well. So we change what we know, or we apply a nonlinear transformation to it to be able to essentially learn new things. And then this process we've talked about, that's a single graph layer, what's called the basic graph layer in the code. And by repeating this process, so the new state we get after this aggregation, we use that as the starting state in the next layer, and we repeat this process. By doing this, we kind of send these messages around. So think of this as this like forwarding information throughout this network, or the gossip in our neighborhood. So then the question is what information to actually send to our neighbors. And as I said before, what we typically do is this HI, that's the state of our current node, this ledger, we compute a new value, let's say based on a specified function. We call it the message function. And often we might implement that just using a neural network, like in this case. So this is a simple one hidden layer neural network. This allows our model to kind of, it doesn't have to kind of send everything it knows. It can send only the things which are relevant to its neighbors. But then the question is, after we have written these messages to this outbox, how do we then aggregate information? So how do I read the messages from my neighbors? And in particular, there are things to think about here that we would like to be able to change the order of these mail slots, but still keep, the neighbors I have intact. So it shouldn't matter, exactly where my neighbor's mail slot is, as long as I have a reference to that mail slot. So it needs to be invariant of permutation of these rows. Also, you can see that each node here has actually a different number of neighbors. So node 1 here only has a single neighbor, while node 2 has 3 neighbors. So this aggregation we do cannot be for a fixed number of neighbors. If it is, then our model will be severely limited. So we need some kind of aggregating this information, which is permutation invariant and don't care about how many neighbors you are, or can handle arbitrary number of neighbors. So this is the basic issue, which is also kind of the basic issue with the whole graph neural network, that we can have arbitrary sized inputs. The very simple way of solving it in graph neural networks, and in general in these kind of models, is using the sum operator. So the aggregation is simply taking the sum of my neighborhood vectors. And why is sum nice? Well, one of the important things is that the sum operator it's permutation invariant. So by being commutative and associative, we can actually change the order of these vectors and we will get the exact same result. So this desired property of permutation invariant is built into the sum operator. And then another neat property, since these are neural networks, we want to train them using gradient descent, then it's nice that they are easily differentiable. So if we think of these f and g, those are vector valued functions. So think of them as these x's. These x's are the result of some computation. So a graph neural network layer, for example, or an MLP. So the neat thing about the derivative of a sum is that it's the same as the sum of the derivatives. So we have a very easy way of differentiating these aggregations. As an example, taking the max here would perhaps not be as good. We'll still be able to, well, no, let's not dive into that now. I could say just a couple of things about these, the sum operator and other operators. So in graph neural networks, there have been a couple of used aggregation methods. So the max operation has been one, to essentially take the max along each dimension of all of your vectors. Or mean has also been used. But it's been shown that actually using a sum is strictly more expressive than the mean, and the mean is strictly more expressive than using the max. So you should likely not use the max in this aggregation operation. So as we just mentioned, that this property of whether summing is a good idea, that depends on the assumption that we're actually operating in high dimensional space. So this has been shown that this kind of construction, or this what I'll show you here, I'll talk a bit about what it actually does. It's a universal approximator for function on sets. So a function on a set of values to the real numbers can be approximated by this kind of construction. So the construction is essentially, imagine we have here a set of scalars in this case. And for each of them, we apply some nonlinear function, which goes from like 1D to n d in this case. So n here is the size of our latent space. So think of that as the sizes of the vectors in our graph neural network. So we apply a nonlinear transformation to each of the xi's in our input and get a new vector. So these squares here, vector, or I mean, in this case, think of them as vectors. And then these vectors, if you pack them together, you can think of that as a matrix. So it's n, it's the size of our vectors, and m is the number of nodes in our graph. And then by summing these together, you get a new Rn dimensional vectors. This would be the sum of our neighborhood vectors, for example. And then applying a new nonlinear function on top of that. In this case, it's for a scalar valued, approximating a scalar valued function, but by having multiple of these construction in parallel, you can then approximate a vector valued function. But this relies on that the dimensionality now of n must be large enough to be able to, well, essentially map in all of your different elements here. So it needs to be proportional to the size of the set you're operating. This is, I think of this more as this is an important like foundation to say that, well, this construction we're using, it is at least potentially expressive enough. But just like with the universal approximation theorem for regular feedforward neural networks, it's no guarantee that our network will actually learn the thing we need to learn. And it might also be difficult to say, well, the size m, I mean, this only shows this for, a fixed set. But if we don't really know what will the sizes of m be in our case, I think it's we can kind of use this to say that our method will become, as good as the real function we're approximating. Anyway, so back to the graph neural network. So the answer to how we aggregate is that we sum. The thing we do is we sum the nodes in our neighborhood. So the aggregation function of M. M is here our matrix of feature vectors, or node feature vectors, neighbor feature vectors, I should say. And then the aggregation for node I here is then the sum of all the j here in the neighborhood of I. So this neighborhood of I, that will return all of the indices for our neighbors. So for node 1, it would return just 2. So it will only be n2. For node 2, it will be 1, 3, and 4. And then we can think of this as this memory. So just a note here on the transpose, that's just so that M here is actually rows of these feature vectors. By convention, vector is typically seen as a column vector. So this just puts the feature vectors in the rows here of M. So we also want to keep the information from before. So what we can do then is we add the HI we have, and then we add this transformed age from our neighbors. So the M here previously, like we discussed back here, that comes from this message of HI. So this message, that's a function, typically a simple neural network like shown here. But it could be any function you like. It could be a very deep network, or it could be just a linear transformation. The latter is probably not always very useful. Depends on what you're doing with the things. We'll talk a bit more about this in the transformer case. So the aggregation, once again, we take the information we already have in the node. We might want to transform this as well. So we might have a separate MLP on top of this first, so that we treat the information, our local information, differently from the information we send to our neighbors. And this we will see in the example that we have two multi-layer perceptrons in our basic graph layer. We apply it to our current node state to get two new matrices. One which is the centered matrix, or this HI, the information I would like to keep. And one is the node feature matrix, that's information I would like to send away. And then we aggregate it by just summing over the rows of this M matrix. So we could think of this in another way. So previously here, I showed that we use the sum here is over the nodes in our neighborhood. We could instead think of the sum being over all nodes. So we still do basically the same thing, but we make the sum over all nodes. And instead of selecting the nodes here for the sum operator, we essentially have this indicator function. So the indicator function, it will take the value 1 if j is in my neighborhood, and otherwise it will take the value 0, but still times this message. So as an explicit example here for node 2, this would look like this. So we would take 1 for h1 because node 1 is in the neighborhood of 2, 0 times h2 because we don't have self loops in this case, so we don't consider 2 to be a neighbor of 2. And then 1 for 3 because 3 is a neighbor of 2, and 1 for 4 because it's a neighbor of 2. But 0 for 5 because it's not a neighbor of 2. And why do this? Well, the observation here is that we can actually implement this using a vector matrix multiplication. So this sum of ones and zeros, if you put all of these coefficients before these messages into a vector, and then we stack all of the messages in rows like this, then we can do the same aggregation as before, but with this vector matrix multiplication. And why would we want to do that? This indicator variable function, do we need to implement this? Well, actually, this is the thing we talked a bit about yesterday, this adjacency matrix. This node aggregation for node 2 here, we can perform by taking the row of the adjacency matrix, multiply that with our current node state here. So you see that we can actually take, if we write this out a bit more explicitly, first we consider just a single row for node I here, aggregate node I, but we can make all of them at the same time by simply taking the full adjacency matrix, or this matrix of indicator variables, but that is the adjacency matrix. And then multiply the adjacency matrix with this node state. So the first notebook you will look at uses this kind of explicit sum, and we use a representation of the neighborhoods, which allows us to do that. But then we'll take the next step into using the adjacency matrix instead. So the full picture then, now this is a different graph from before. We can think of this, what we're doing here, essentially in separate steps. So when I showed you the different node aggregations, you can think of this as kind of unfolding this thing we actually do in parallel, unfolding this matrix operation into the separate aggregation steps. That corresponds to, if you look at this view of the kind of graph of the computations we will do, each neighborhood aggregation, so in this case, 1 is neighbor of 2 and 3. So here, to aggregate 2 here, we aggregate 1 and 3. So I should mention that these correspond to the green boxes is the first layer of a graph neural network. The red box is the second layer of graph neural network. And what this shows us is the kind of computational graph we go through to generate the information in the place in this node feature matrix for node 1 after 2 layers. So node 1 will look at these, will have information from these nodes after 2 layers. This will also show you that, well, if we only have 2 layers, node 1 will actually not have any information about node 5, because 2 hops is not enough to get that information. So just like with a convolutional neural network, this construction has this kind of receptive field limitation. It will not be able to look further, more hops away than our network, the layers in our network. So this kind of tries to show this unfolded view and the receptive field of this graph neural network. And then we can also think of the picture I showed you before. So each step here, each layer here, perform this first compute the messages, get new state for the messages. So these would be our neighbor vectors, and then aggregate them using some kind of aggregation method. But the sum is a very good one. And then to actually use the result of this computation, so the GNN encoder, as we call it in the notebooks, it produces as many outputs as it had inputs. So as many output vectors as it had input vectors. Then after that, depending on what we want to do with this graph, we apply different so-called prediction heads. So in this case, you see for node prediction, we will have a separate classifier neural network applied to each of the nodes. Not a separate. I should highlight that these pink boxes, they are the same neural network. We just apply it to each of the nodes. Then we have some kind of target, this blue box. We know what we would like to predict for that node, and then we compute the loss based on our prediction. So you can think of this as kind of convolving our prediction head over our output node features. Then with edge prediction, this really depends on what it is that you want to do. So you could think of this as edge prediction. You want to predict some property of the edges you know are in the graph, some property which is not part of the input. So it could, for some reason, some kind of relationship. You know there is a relationship between the nodes, but you would like to know more attributes about that relationship. So that's one way of doing this, and then you would know which graphs you want to compute the error for. You could also try to predict missing edges, but that complicates things. In that case, you need to compute you need to make prediction for all pairs of nodes which do not have an edge between them, essentially. But it's the same idea that we then have a function which takes 2 vectors as inputs and outputs a single prediction. And how to combine those 2 input vectors? Well, we can use the sum once again, or if we actually want this to be permutation sensitive, so to say, we can use concatenation. So in the HackMD, I wrote a little bit about that when it comes to, for example, sequences. If we have a sequence of vectors and the order is important, then concatenation makes more sense. And finally, the example we'll look at here, we get an arbitrary number of output vectors, and then we want to predict a single thing. So here we also need to do some form of aggregation. So the last thing here, this is what you will be working with in the notebooks. And I'll show you a couple of things about the notebooks. Where did I put them? So there are two notebooks. The first one, notebook 3A, this only goes through the graph neural network encoder. So we'll look at all of these layers, these graph convolutions. We'll talk a bit about the aggregation function and the message function, and then talking a bit about how we can use these IDs to aggregate the information in the network. We'll also mention a bit how to think about edge features and how could we use that information. And then we'll look at mini batches, and here we will actually make use of these mask functions you computed yesterday from your collate function. So you can see there's this collate graph function. This is the one which creates these masks, which you will then use to here in the where we actually want to use this these batches. So here the node masks will be very important. So at the end here, what you will have is this graph encoder. You will have the box, this green box. But then to later make predictions on them, you will need to do something with these vectors. So we want to do a graph prediction. So the task here for this session is to take this set of vectors and then reduce them to a single vector. In the second notebook, you will take what was learned in the first, can I close this like so? We'll take the encoder from the first notebook, the one which uses batches, and then we will train this on the same data set as before, as yesterday. One important difference is that this network will actually make use of these edge features. So you might get better performance, better predictive performance, perhaps worse computational performance. And then the task here. So the task here is to take what you did in the first notebook and essentially insert this into the full network. So you need to take a prediction head, this graph prediction head, and you need to combine it with the encoder, and you need to merge the representations to be able to do that. So your task here is to implement these two pooling or add these two pooling functions. You did them in the first notebook, so that should be straightforward. Then you also have to think about how to pass information from the encoder to the graph head. There's also an additional task here. One weakness of graph neural networks is that this aggregation operation we do will eventually tend to spread the same information everywhere in the network, which means that the more rounds of message passing you do, the more smoothed out the, say, picture of the network will be. So the features of the network will tend to become very similar to each other. So one remedy for this is what's called the residual connections. Residual connections are actually quite simple. So instead of our nonlinear transformation layers, or our graph layer in this case, just instead of only keeping instead of getting information only through that kind of function, we also add kind of a skip connection. The word skip connection has a bit more general meaning in neural networks, but this is a very simple skip connection. So instead of just outputting the value directly from our, in this case, an MLP, but it could be from a graph layer, we also add the input we had. This will essentially allow information from the nodes to kind of pass on the side of any transformation we do to them. And the task here is to implement this either in the graph layer, which you have looked at before previously, or in the encoder. So you can choose to do it in either place. And that are the tasks for the first session. So welcome everyone to the final session this Friday afternoon. So it's great that so many of you have stayed with us. It's been, I think, the morning notebook, it was a lot to wrap your head around. and this notebook will also be quite a lot to kind of try to like chew. I will try to give you a bit more context of what we are doing to kind of explain the reasoning behind this notebook, and also try to highlight the point we like to make with this notebook. So the reason for having this workshop on not just graph neural network or just not transformers is that from my point of view, these two models are actually in the same design space, so to say. They do very similar things with data. So first of all, we're now at the 4th session. So we're going to talk about going from graph neural networks to transformers. So first of all, a short recap of what we have talked about so far. So we have this view of graph neural networks as kind of message passing algorithm, or a learned message passing algorithm, or a learned gossip algorithm, where each layer in our graph neural network essentially performs one step of message passing. So we send our current information, or we send something based on current information to our neighbors. This way, information about the whole network structure can kind of be disseminated in the network. We can then use, after a while, this aggregated information to make predictions about the actual network structure, or the graph structure, I should say. But there are some limitations with this, and that is that essentially we're making fixed information aggregations. So we can think of this as we essentially have a receptive field. So if we have a two-layer neural network, we're essentially limited to aggregating two-hop neighborhoods. So any structural information we would like to learn about, which is on a larger scale than that, this model will not be able to learn. We can try to solve that by adding more layers in our graph neural network, but there will always be this kind of hard limit on the kind of interactions we can learn. There will also always be a locality bias. It will be much easier for the network to learn things which are close, small local interactions, not small, local interactions, but small structures essentially in these graphs, because that information is directly available. So it's harder for the network to learn to aggregate things over very long distances. So there are cases where this will actually become a problem. So I'll use these two as examples, but we could think of other problems where we would have similar cases. But for example, for molecules, certain properties we might be interested about the molecules might be over longer ranges. So molecules might have parts which have, or at least kind of have degrees of freedom. So we might have bonds which can rotate around, and we might have a slight flex if there were very long chains in this molecule. It can kind of contort or take different shapes. That means that things which are in the graph far away might actually be close together in the 3D space these molecules actually live in. So if we wanted to know things about the force field of these molecules, then perhaps the graph structure doesn't give us enough information, at least if we start to have rather long paths in this molecule. So there's this concept called diameter in a graph, and that essentially tries to measure what is the longest, shortest path between any nodes that tells us something about the size of a graph. So that's one example. Another example in this physics simulation, I showed you an example of yesterday, where they have this cloth, and they want to simulate the physics of the cloth interacting with other objects. So you can see in the first picture here that the cloth is kind of folding. That means that points which are actually far apart on the mesh, so to say, might become close together when the cloth is folded. So you would actually like, for the next step, perhaps in your simulation, the mesh now collide with itself. But to be able to calculate that information, which might be on a very long scale, a regular graph neural network couldn't handle that. So one way of handling it, as I show here, is that you essentially add additional edges to your graph, edges computed in this case based on a three-dimensional positions of each node or each vertex in this mesh. So this idea of actually we can add information which is computed from a function. That is what we'll be talking about today. So before we do that, I'd like to kind of take another view on graph neural networks. So instead of this this message passing view, we're going to instead think of these as being a kind of computer. So we talked about this mailbox before us, these states or nodes. We can actually think of them as our current memory. And then our neural computer in this case, it's a neural network which operates on a memory. And each step of this neural computer, each processing steps, updates the memory. So this will be exactly analogous to updating the node state for our graph neural network. But now we're kind of decoupling ourselves from thinking about the graph structure. So we'll still use the graph structure in the computations we do, so in our aggregation function here. But instead of focusing too much on that, instead we can think of this transition from, on the left here we have, the node state. Let's call this our memory at one time step. Then after processing that node state in some fashion, we get a new node state, a new memory state. So we can think of the things which goes on here as kind of being a central processing unit. So as kind of a rough sketch of how we can think about this. So in a simple computer, we'll have input and outputs. We're not going to think so much about them here. Instead, we're going to think about this interaction between the central processing unit, the CPU, and the memory. So in a computer, we have some kind of memory. Our CPU reads things from memory, performs an operation on the things it has read to memory, and then writes back an updated value to memory. And the way we will do this in our neural computer, so the analogy to a graph neural network and what we can think of the graph neural network as doing, is it takes the current memory state. It has some kind of differentiable module which selects what memory rows to read. It then applies some kind of transformation function, so this processing, and updates the memory state. And in our neural computer, we will then do this read function and update for each memory slot. So the goal is to update each memory slot. We will kind of do this in parallel. So read function can be, we can think of almost anything, but we'll look at the special cases we have already seen in the graph neural network. And then we apply this read function in parallel to update all of the memory slots. So in the end, we get something like this, where this read function might read from every memory and then update a memory slot, and we do this in parallel. So you should almost recognize the graph neural network here. So what I'm showing you here is a transformer layer. So yeah, just a couple of things about the transformer layer before we compare it to the graph neural network. So one thing about the transformer layer, just like the graph neural network, is that it is invariant to the order of the memory slots. So for example, if I have initialized each memory slot with the vector representation of a word, we typically call them word embeddings, then I can later on rearrange those memory slots, the turquoise things here, and my transformer will still do the same thing. So to be able to actually handle sequential information in the original transformer, what we do is that we also have an embedding which encodes what position a word occurs on. So we add this P1, that's a vector which is, think of a categorical variable which has the value 1 if this word was at position 1. So this is similar to this idea I talked about yesterday, where we can, by summing the embedding vectors of multiple categorical variables, we can still get a vector representation which can make sense. Now, we're not going to dive too deep into this, but there are cases where our network will not be able to distinguish between these things. That comes with the aggregation operation we're doing. We're not going to dive too deep into that, but there are issues with this. You might need to do special things, but for a transformer, this works. For a regular transformer, this is a fine way of doing it. I will point out another way of doing it later when we talk a bit more about the similarities between the transformer and the graph neural network. So just like with the graph neural network, we start out with some state in our memory. So with the graph neural network, the initial state was these node feature vectors we created with our embeddings and continuous variables. So we have the original state represent some attributes about the nodes. And then we pass these, we initialize our memory with these vectors, and then we apply our neural computer to this memory in a couple of steps. So each step corresponds to one layer. So exactly like the graph neural network, we do as many computation steps as we have layers. The difference between the graph neural network is that this read function, the red box, can read from arbitrary memory slots, while in the graph neural network we constrained ourselves. But just like with the graph neural network, we'll get as many outputs as we gave inputs to the transformer. And then in the end, to make predictions on this input, we do precisely like with the graph neural network, we have some kind of prediction head, which we apply on the final memory state. So for example, if we want to do node prediction in the graph neural network, but in this case, this would be, the input could be an arbitrary set of vectors, and we want to do some prediction for each of the sets in the input, then we can apply just a prediction head on top of that, or a small multi-layer perceptron, for example, or just linear regression if we don't want to have something very simple. And then to do something more like graph prediction, so predicting or set predictions, really predict something from the whole input, we can then do some kind of aggregation on that output. But since we also in this model, we don't necessarily constrain ourselves to a certain hard way of reading from memory. Any memory position can potentially have information about the whole input from the very first step. We'll talk a bit more about this later. This means that we could actually just have a single prediction on one of the inputs. In the case of transformers, what people typically do is that you kind of add a special input vector, and they use the output related to this vector as your kind of your representation for the whole input set. So then you train typically a classifier or some prediction head on only the vector which you initialized with that special token. This you can also do in your transformer. Doing this with a graph neural network, then you would likely want to add a node and make that node be connected to all other nodes. That would allow you to do the same thing in a graph neural network. And the interesting thing about that is you can essentially learn what to aggregate. Instead of simply aggregating by the mean or the sum, you might potentially learn to apply relevant transformations throughout the network to the things you aggregate. So finally, here we'll kind of make the similarity a bit clearer. So on the left, we have the transformer. It has this read function, which is an all-to-all read function, essentially. We could think of this as actually being something similar to feeding a complete graph into a graph neural network. It's not exactly the same. I'll explain a bit about that later when we see the difference in detail. Another difference is that the transformer applies a nonlinear transformation on the aggregated, what it has read essentially. But we can see that if we were to shift this to have it before the memory, we would still do the same thing, doing this before. So what I want to point out is that here we kind of show three different memory states. This with letters that would correspond to this updated memory in this case. But if we do that before or after the picture here, it's the same thing essentially. So in that regard, they are almost the same architecture. So the transform function in a transformer, that's just a regular multi-layer perceptron, typically with some kind of relative unit, but that there's such a huge number of different variations here for transformers, but some kind of nonlinearity, and some seem to matter, some seems to be of minor importance, exactly what you're doing there. The question is really how do we do this read function, which reads from the previous memory slots to update the new memory slots. So in our graph neural network, we showed how this message reading operation can be implemented by essentially taking our adjacency matrix and multiplying that with our, in this case, our neighborhood node state. That's what we call this. But if you think of this as some kind of memory, this aggregation is implemented by multiplying the memory with our adjacency matrix. That performs the aggregation we see here on the top here. So this vector of indicator variables, you can think of this adjacency matrix as actually being a matrix where each element is computed based on the pair of nodes which that element corresponds to. So in this case, we use the indicator function to say whether is node 1 in the neighborhood of 1 or is node n in the neighborhood of 1. So you can this is a function. So in the case of graph neural network, it is typically the indicator function. We have this aggregation operator, we could think of it. Or we could think of this as our read function. So this is the thing which decides what memory slots to read from to aggregate information to then process into a new memory state. Now, this matrix could actually be anything. It's nice if the values are positive, because otherwise it might become a bit weird. Let's not dive too deep into that. But essentially, we can think of this as a mask. So just like we have looked at masks in the case of these handling the batches, we can think of this as kind of a read mask. So it selects what parts of the output to include. So each row of this mask, just like with we saw the row of the adjacency matrix, which we could use to aggregate neighborhoods according to like the graph structure. Each element here decides how much of this memory slot, so the first element here decides how much of the first memory slot should I use when aggregating the neighborhood for updating the first memory slot. And here you see this third row that it decides how much of the memory should I use when aggregating the third memory slot. So in this case, for example, how much of vector 4 or memory slot 4 should I use when updating slot 3. So I hope you can see the similarity between the adjacency matrix and how we use that to aggregate the node neighborhood in the graph neural network to how this more general, this can aggregate information from all over the network. We are allowed to make all-to-all connections essentially. So this mask can read from any memory slot. The question is how to decide how to do that. And then the way it is done in a transformer is to essentially define a function which computes that value. So we have some function. It can be almost any function, but it operates on the some kind of pairwise information about these two memory slots we want to weigh together, or rather want to decide how much to use one memory slot when updating one memory slot. This sounds confusing, but to make it clearer, just like when we asked ourselves what information from this outbox should we use when updating the memory for node 2 here, then we use the adjacency matrix. So the row from the adjacency matrix, which has a 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, that's what we used as a mask to read this memory. Now we're just opening up to actually allowing these values to instead being fixed, decided in the input or hard-coded in the input. We allow the neural network to perhaps, if this is a learnable function, to learn what memory slots to read. So this function typically takes as input the representation of the target memory slot, and the representation of the memory slot to read from, and then computes a value. In the transformer, it's then normalized. So the softmax normalizes these vectors, so it makes sure all of them are positive and that they sum to 1. It also kind of exaggerates any differences. So you will kind of have exponential, and the difference will be exponentiated. So this will actually make it easier to also get very small values. So you will actually have values here which are close to 0, and some values which might be very high, depending, of course, on what these functions compute. So in the transformer, the original transformer architecture, the choice of this function is one of the simplest we can think of. So we take the values of these two memory slots, and we take the dot product between them. They scale this by a factor, which is essentially about trying to account for the variance in these vectors. So the longer the vectors are, the higher the variance in this dot product would be. So then they say, okay, by scaling by the dimensionality or the square root of the dimensionality, we're essentially trying to normalize or standardize the activations a bit, which then probably makes learning faster. So each element here is computed by the current value of the memory. Now there is a problem if you were to do that right off, and that is that the dot product or the vectors which maximizes the dot product are those which are collinear. I mean, the dot product, if one vector has very large magnitude, of course, you will also get very large outputs. But essentially, there will be a kind of a bias if you take the memory values as they are and do the dot product between them to the diagonal matrix here. The values will be high along the diagonal because the dot product between the vector and itself will be very high. So a simple remedy for that in the transformer is to actually apply a transformation to the memory values. And they have two different transformations, which they call query and key transformations. It doesn't really matter which we think is which. It's important that we do transform the memory slots in two different ways. So that when we take the dot product between them, it's not just the dot product between a vector and itself. So we essentially get something like this. So this matrix I showed you before, let's go back a step. So each element here is the dot product between the corresponding memory contents. So in this case, the dot product between M1 and M1. And as I said, that would be a high bias, while this would be between M3 and M4, scaled by this constant, d, square root of d. We can actually express this as just a matrix multiplication. So if you think of Q here as each row of Q has a transformed version of the memory contents for that slot. So you can see down here, we have our previous memory, so M in this case, but we first multiply that with matrix. So essentially just doing a linear transformation of the memory contents. And then we do the same with we do another such transformation. So we essentially will have think of two new memory states, which will be different. So the dot product between the same slot in this memory state will no longer necessarily be high. And then you can perform the dot product between all of these pairs in this to get this matrix by just doing a matrix multiplication. And then in the end, we multiply each result there with this scalar, 1 over square root of d. So that is the way we compute an adjacency matrix in the transformer, essentially. We will look at, in the notebooks, this is what we will do. So this is, in kind of summarizing this, is that we want to have something which is like an adjacency matrix. It will be this read mask, which tells us how much of the neighborhood or memory state we should aggregate in the read phase. We implement this in the transformer by taking the dot product between transformed versions of the current memory state. We can think of this as kind of similar to what we did in the graph neural network, where we started by transforming the neighborhood and then transforming the center node, so to say, and then pass these to either we just sum them together, but we might also pass them through a function which computes some pairwise relationship between the things. In that case, the pairwise relationship was really, that's the thing we aggregate. We're not doing that in a transformer typically. The incoming values are not directly transformed by a nonlinear transformation. But this then becomes our kind of soft adjacency matrix we could think of. And the analogy to graph neural network, if we were to view a graph neural network from the lens of a transformer, it would be the one on the left. And we've already covered this, that the neighborhood aggregation we do with a graph neural network is very similar to what we do in a transformer, this read operation in a transformer. In that we, for each row in this matrix, we decide how much of the current memory to use when updating the corresponding row in the memory. And now instead of deciding on that read mask based on the graph structure, we could actually compute each of those values using a function. And this is what's used in what is called graph transformers often. There are graph transformers are a lot of different kind of architecture are named graph transformers, but most of them have this idea in mind that we still have kind of the basic transformer that we compute these values using this thing called scaled dot product attention. But then we add another term which corresponds to some information about these pairs of things. And graph neural networks is natural to let this information be, for example, the edge attributes. But we could also add other things, like let's say the distance between these nodes, some kind of distance metric, like let's say just Euclidean distance between the nodes, or it could be, as we'll see in the example, we could actually include the shortest path between any two nodes, which will then give our network a lot of extra information, which might make it able to solve problems which would be much harder to try to learn to solve. So that's kind of the basic setup for this last notebook, where we'll go from a basic transformer and then see how we can augment that with adding the same information as we have in our graph neural network. Start the recording now. So just to wrap up this this workshop, where did my presentation end up? I think I might have to do like that. Not that one, but that one. So I see the issue I had before. So I'd like to just give a brief overview of what we have talked about today with this final recap. So the first sessions was really about, getting the problem you have represented as conceptual graph or representational graph into these neural network tensors. So we spent a lot of time talking about these things with features and how to combine them into a single feature vector for each node in the graph. And then we briefly looked a bit at how we can create these data sets, which do this for us. And then these edge features, how we can think about those. So I'll get back to the edge features because in the last notebook here, we have seen an example of those. We talked a bit about this batching of graphs, and then also this issue of every step we do here doesn't really know that these are actually, there are a lot of places in these tensors which are invalid. So we'll need to mask them to actually create the result which is valid in the end. Now, we talked a lot about multiplying things with the adjacency matrix today. And as you have seen, the adjacency matrix have a lot of zeros. And in particular, the adjacency matrices, if you think of this stacked batch here is actually the node features. But imagine doing the same thing with the adjacency matrices. So imagine these blue things now being adjacency matrices. Now those will kind of be square. So you'll have to imagine this being more of a actual cube. So imagining stacking adjacency matrices, well, all of the adjacency matrices which are smaller than the largest one will actually have a lot of zeros on its columns and rows. So the adjacency matrix will, in essence, have these masks. So when we multiply this tensor with our adjacency matrices, it will actually perform this masking for us. So explicitly creating the mask as we have done here would not necessarily be, we don't have to do it until the very end. So the last graph layer should mask the outputs. So if we calculate the sum or the mean, we get valid outputs. But the other layers could actually rely on the adjacency matrix to do kind of the masking for us. I didn't think about that when I created the notebooks, and I think it's a bit a subtle thing to realize. So anyway, we use the mask explicitly here to essentially set parts of these values to 0. If you delved into the attention function of the transformer, you saw that we also explicitly set values in the tension matrix to -infinity, in that case, the invalid values, so that after applying the softmax, they will be hard zeros. You might also have seen that we don't multiply with a mask to achieve that in that case. Instead, we use this tensor fill operation. So if you want to do a more efficient masking, that is a better way of doing it, because you don't have to actually do all of these multiplications, which are more costly than just writing values to those memory spots. But the masking is more general. You can use it for a lot of different places. For example, to apply dropout to the result of a neural network. This is one way of doing it, that you essentially generate a mask using these random binary variables, and then you multiply that mask with your current activations. So then we talked a lot about this message passing neural network, and we looked a bit how we could start with only using the node features and aggregate them in a neighborhood. We also talked a lot about the adjacency matrix and how we can use multiplication with the adjacency matrix to perform these aggregations. And the reason for pointing that out is that, now I'm one step ahead. So our message passing neural network, one of the important properties is that it's agnostic to the input size. So we can actually handle arbitrarily sized inputs without the computations breaking. But then to do anything useful with that, or rather with the output of this model, we then apply these prediction heads. And in this notebook you have seen us using a graph prediction head. I have also linked in the materials to notebooks which show rough outlines of the node prediction head and the pair prediction head. I mean, both of these prediction heads are really simple. The hard part is actually creating typically the targets for these problems. So the blue boxes here, the things we want to use for a loss function. The reason for why that is difficult is here you also need to be mindful of what values are actually invalid or not. So here you will actually need to mask the loss values so that you essentially zero out the loss values for which are invalid. And then to actually have a reasonable mean of the loss, then for a batch, you will have to take into account similar things as we did when we calculated the mean using the mask in notebook 3A and the start of notebook 3B. So if you're curious, you can have a look there, but the problems in that notebook aren't finished. So the example of how you actually do the loss masking isn't there, which I think is one of the more important details to think about. So then I went on to kind of try to make this connection between graph neural networks and transformers. So I started trying to liken them to kind of differentiable or a neural computer, where if we think of this, the state of our node vectors as instead being slots in a memory, then having the graph layer is actually a kind of CPU, which reads things from memory, process these things, and then updates the memory with what it has processed. And we apply these to update all of the memory slots. There is a limitation though with graph neural network, and it comes from this only working on local neighborhoods. For a lot of problems, this is actually enough. You can solve a lot of interesting problems using only this. But for a lot of other problems, you might need to take into account longer range interactions. So what we did then was to say, well, we've used this adjacency matrix to combine information in our memory, so to say, or think of the node vectors. What if we could, instead of just assuming that we use the local structure from the graph, compute how much we should read from each and every node in our memory when we update the memory slot? So this was this idea of computing the adjacency matrix, essentially, or the matrix we call the attention matrix in transformers. And I hope that this connection is relatively clear, that they do a very similar operation, transformers and graph neural networks, in that they multiply a current state, so current set of vectors, so our node vectors for our graph, or these memory vectors for our transformer. So multiply that with this attention matrix, which acts kind of as a read mask. And we showed how you could, in the graph or in the transformer, you could essentially extend a general regular transformer by adding some kind of function on the edge information between each pair of nodes. We showed how, so we dived a bit into the details about how the transformer work. I don't think this shouldn't be the thing you focus on taking with you from the course. It's just an example of a very simple attention function we can use, one of the simplest. So then we make this connection a bit clearer. One thing which I'd like to point out here is that it's common to say that, well, the updated memory slot here for x1 L plus 1, that it's somehow connected to x1 L here. So L denotes the number of steps or layers we have applied the function for. So it's important to point out that this memory slot doesn't have to have anything to do necessarily with this memory slot anymore. It can contain aggregate information from all memory slots. So it could be some completely different information than what was in the initial state of x1 here. And in a way, the same holds for graph neural networks as well. So even though we still think of each of these nodes as somehow having the identity of the original graph, they don't necessarily have to have that. Now, if the problem we're working on does node prediction, then likely there will still be, or the network will learn to associate the output that node with the actual input vector. But if we instead aggregate all of the nodes in a network, then they are free to represent anything they can with the receptive field they have. So to think of them as necessarily, capturing something of the place, the place one, so to say, can be misleading. And in transformers, people sometimes talk about contextualized word representation, but that is likely not a correct view of the outputs from a transformer. We typically use a training task which encourages the outputs to actually have some relation to the input position. But if we then train our transformer in other ways, let's say this encoder decoder style transformer, then there's nothing which requires the outputs of the transformer to have anything to do with the word inputs at those positions. So this just illustrates this idea of aggregating neighborhoods using the adjacency matrix. I wonder why. Sorry, this slide was out of place. Because really what I kind of wanted to finish with is this connection. And then I also wanted to just dive in a bit into this question about these pairwise features or edge features. As we saw in the last example of the notebook, we look at the shortest path between nodes. So what we essentially do in the last notebooks is that we create a complete graph. In the earlier notebooks, this 3 tensor which is the pairwise information between the neighboring nodes in the graph, that was typically quite sparse. In the last example, we actually have information in all of these places, information about the shortest path between two nodes up to a maximum value. I think I chose K3 here to see if performance could be somewhat reasonable. It couldn't. So the reason why I want to show this is to kind of show you the intuition then about these extra features we add to be able to then learn things either using the attention function to operate on these features or to actually use information from these edges to learn something about the network. So what we can do then, and there was a question here about we added the information either in the attention function, the pairwise information, or we added the pairwise information in these vectors we compute. So the latter thing, adding it to the vector we compute, that's like these personalized messages we talked about with the graph neural networks. The reason we do this is because if we only use this information in the attention, our neural network will not be able to create any kind of representation of the edge information. It will only use it to select what node features to use. So by also creating these personalized messages, we can actually, the representation of the graph in the end can also include information about the edges. So also before I finish this, I just wanted to show you this. So this is an interesting paper. It was published as a workshop paper at ICLR 2020 from MIT has a strong group in graph neural networks and especially graph neural networks for chemistry. And this idea of a path augmented transformer is actually something they explain here using similar ways as we do in this workshop, not exactly the same formulation, but this general idea of instead of just having a graph with edge information, we also add this shortest path information between all pairs of nodes. So this idea of path augmented graph transformer. But they use a slightly different attention mechanisms. So I will add this as a reference to the notebook. So if you want to find it, then go back to the notebook, not your copy, because that will no longer be up to date, and have a look at the reference. I'll also add it to my slides here at the end.